Good morning, everybody. This is Giorgia Verri from CMCC Foundation. So today we are glad to have Loreta Cornacchia from Deltares with us for the coastal resilience webinar series. My task is to briefly introduce all of you the CMCC Foundation, which is one of the two organizers of today's webinar. Then I leave the floor to the other organizer, which is the Decade Collaborative Center on Coastal Resilience, which is led by Professor Nadia Pinardi from University of Bologna. And then Professor Pinardi will introduce our speaker, Loreta Cornacchia. So speaking of CMCC Foundation, very briefly, this is a no-profit research organization, and our mission is to contribute to enhance the knowledge of the climate system with a multidisciplinary approach. Our aim is double. I would say that there is a scientific aim, which I highlighted in the blue keywords, but also a social aim, which is instead highlighted in red. The scientific aim is to investigate, to monitor, and to model all the components of the Earth system, covering multiple time and space scales, with a multidisciplinary approach, and we aim at enhancing the scientific knowledge of the climate system, and to understand the interaction among the Earth system components and the interaction of the Earth system with our society and our economy. The social aim consists of contributing to the sustainable growth, to the environmental protection, and to promote science-based adaptation and mitigation policies and action, taking into account our changing climate, but also our changing society and changing economy. The CMCC research activities are carried out by several divisions, which belong to three main institutes. From top to bottom, there is the Institute for the Earth System Prediction, the Institute for the Climate Resilience, and the Institute for Economy and Environment. Each of them carries out specific activities, and we all contribute to offer a multidisciplinary knowledge of the climate system and to propose strategies, best practices, and adaptation mitigation action with a scientific basis. So the CMCC has owned a supercomputing center since 2008. It consists of two interacting HPC facilities, which are among the most advanced in Europe. And to give you some key numbers, the computational capacity consists of about 25,000 of cores, but it will increase in the next months up to 32,000. And the theoretical peak performance of our HPC facilities is of 2.4 petaflops, which means 2.4 trillions of operations per second. The storage system capacity is of about 32 petabytes so far, and the archiving system capacity is currently about 40 petabytes. The CMCC offices are distributed across the national territory. There are 7 buildings from north to south, which are highlighted in the picture. And we can also rely on the collaboration with 8 institutional partners, which are academia and research institutes. All of them except one are Italian, while the Resources for Future is a no-profit research institute based in Washington, D.C. A final piece of information from my side is about the question and answer session that will be held at the end after the seminar. And how it works. Basically, you can put your questions, your comments in the Zoom chat, or you can use the raise hand button. And at the end of the seminar, the moderator will give you the floor. So now I will give the floor to Professor Pinardi to introduce the Decade Collaborative Center on Coastal Resilience. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgia, for the introduction. And good afternoon, everybody. Good morning or good evening. Just want to take out this. Yes. So the Decade Collaborative Center is a new center that will last for the next 4 or 5 years to coordinate the actions for coastal resilience within the UN Decade of the Ocean period. The period of the decade, the UN Decade for Ocean Science, started in 2021 and will end when the Agenda 2030 will be reformed, so in 2030. Our mission is to strengthen the connection between the new science and technology delivered in the Ocean Decade and the coastal stakeholders, focusing on that important part of the human population that really gets together with the ocean. Our strategic objectives are improve science information for all. In this term, we provide international coordination for white papers to be written on specific topics of research and innovation. We try to enhance stakeholder engagement with webinars. We have community of practice, forums, and the newsletter, which hopefully we hope you will subscribe to. And then we would like to promote equitable education. So next year we are starting our educational program. And all this would not be effective without supporting environmental justice for coastal communities. So today, we are very happy to have with us Loreta Cornacchia, who has a research position at the famous Deltares non-profit organization in the Netherlands. Her education is, in the field of natural sciences and biology and ecology. And she has done research at NIOS, again, a very important place for ecosystem research in the Netherlands. She impressed me from the beginning when I met her as one of the innovative thinkers in the field of environmental protection, nature-based solutions for protection of our coast. So they're very much the heart of resilient pathways for the future. And so without taking more time, Loreta, I leave the floor to Loreta. Thank you for being with us.
Yes, thank you very much, Nadia, for the invitation. I will just start sharing my presentation. I think now you should be able to see it. Yeah, so thanks so much for the invite and the great introduction, and for all of you to be here. Today, I will be speaking about how we can harness salt marsh biogeomorphic complexity and use that to inspire and hopefully enhance coastal resilience. So as already mentioned, I will just briefly go over my background. I come from Italy, but moved to the Netherlands to work at NIOS for my PhD. And there I started more in the freshwater environment. So I did a PhD looking at the self-organization patterns in river plants. So how they interact with, like how the plant growth interacts with the water and the sedimentation. and continue on a similar project at CNRS in France, where again I looked at this interaction between flow and flexible canopies. But today I will tell you about my work more in the marine ecosystems, and in particular two studies that I did during my postdoc years, looking into salt marsh biogeomorphology. Yeah, as mentioned already, I am currently working at Deltares. If you're not familiar with it, this is an independent applied research institute, and we deal with everything that has to do with water on the surface and the subsurface. You might have known or used the hydrodynamic software Delft, which is developed at Deltares, but we do also have experimental facilities with, let's say, also wave and current flumes and a geocentrifuge and much more. But yes, today I would like to speak to you about salt marshes. You're probably all familiar with. We are talking about these coastal ecosystems that you find all along the coast in many parts of the world. They are very important because they protect us from storms. They can reduce waves. But at the same time, even in the most optimistic scenario of the future, they are in danger because of sea level rise. So if they cannot grow in elevation to keep up with sea level rise, then they might just drown and disappear in the future. And this is an issue because, as you see also in this picture, there are buildings behind salt marshes. So even our own safety depends on them. And well, when I started looking into salt marshes, there was one feature that really fascinated me, and it is the complexity of the creeks that you can see. So this is the top view of a salt marsh. You see how we can transition from a very smooth tidal flats to some small drainage channels, and then you can go up to having this sort of branching of creeks. So channels that divide into side channels, side channels, and so on. So it's sort of, it's similar to network of blood vessels that bring oxygen to tissues. But in this case, the creeks are bringing water and sediment to the marsh. So they're really also vital for the marsh because they allow sediment that is needed to grow and adapt to sea level rise. And what I wanted to investigate in my postdoc was understanding exactly what determines sedimentation and what is more important for this resilience capacity. So on one hand, biology itself is important because, of course, plants of certain height and density can trap sediment directly. So thereby they help with resilience. But on the other hand, you also have just geomorphology that has a role. As you can see, there's usually higher sediment deposition just next to creeks. So you can notice this highly elevated area just next to the channels. So I wanted to better understand exactly the importance of these factors. So we came up with two different hypotheses. On one hand, the trait hypothesis would state that different traits of the plant species directly affect sedimentation and thereby also adaptation to sea level rise. But on the other hand, we wanted to test whether plant traits had more of an indirect effect by creating these spatial structures, so this complexity of the creek network, and whether that was eventually more important for sedimentation and adaptation. This is, of course, quite hard to test with experiments, so we resorted to using models for that. And in particular, one model called SFERE, which was developed by a PhD student at the time in my group. His name is Roland van de Wijse, and the model was published just last year. So here you can see how the model develops. It's a 2D model starting from just a flat landscape. And there is water input coming from the bottom. You can notice there are these darker areas. These are just random patches of vegetation that then start to grow and interact with the water and the sediment. And eventually, this leads to the formation of a whole salt marsh dissected by tidal channels. So although this is quite a simplified model in many ways, it is still able to capture these multi-scale patterns of channeling that we were interested in. As you can see, if you look on Google Earth, you can find that there's often main channels that then separate into side channels and so on. So this model can also capture this multi-scale patterning. And the main feedback that leads to the formation of this channel network is what is called a scale-dependent feedback. So this is quite a common view. If you go in a salt marsh, you can find these clumps or patches of vegetation. And these plants grow quite close together because they grow chronally. And locally, they can reduce the speed of the water, so they reduce the stress, and this creates a positive feedback for the growth. But at the same time, the water also has to go somewhere, so it will tend to go around the vegetation. And in fact, here you can see erosion and more water. So overall, there is locally a short-range positive effect, but on a larger scale, there is a negative effect. And indeed, just from this simple feedback, you can explain how these salt marshes evolve. So they start from small patches, but in the end, you will have a whole vegetated platform dissected by channels. So as I mentioned, I was interested in understanding this role of creeks or versus plant traits, and in particular in the context of sea level rise. So one thing that the model didn't have at the time was the ability to model how the sediment is transported through the creeks. And that's what I then added during my research there. And I will now show you what the model looks like. This time we impose a certain sediment concentration at the top part. And we can now model how the sediment gets transported through the creeks, which allows us also to play around with the characteristics either of the plants or of the channels to see what would happen to the sedimentation. And this work has now been conditionally accepted pending some last editorial revisions. So hopefully you will be able to see it out this year. So yeah, the good thing about the model is that you can really play around a lot. So I started to modify the traits, so the characteristics of the plants, to see how much would they affect the future marsh development. And in particular, we could change traits associated with above ground effects. So let's say the height or the density of the plants, which mean more friction and more flow resistance. So also more sediment being deposited. But at the same time, we could also change other parameters that are more related to below ground effects. So how strong the root system is and how well it can protect the soil from erosion. And we found that indeed, if you change the plant characteristics, you can find a completely different final morphology of the creeks. And on the left, I show you what happens if the above ground effects are stronger than the below ground root effects. In that case, you end up with a quite simple type of channel network. So there is a lot of first order channels with a few side channels. While on the right side, you see what happens if the below ground effects are stronger than the above ground ones. In that case, the channel network is a lot more complex. You see quite a lot of branching because you have first, second, up to fourth order channels all nested within one another. So in that case, it looks much more like a tree branching in different direction. And if you also go out in the field, you can find this type of different morphologies coming up. You see on the left the very stunning red beach marshes, which are found in China. And on the right, you see this type of more branched creek network, and that's an example from a salt marsh in the Netherlands. Well, the question was still there, however, so are plant traits or is this complexity more important for resilience? And that's still what we needed to disentangle. So in that case, we ran either simulation where we used different characteristics of the plants, but the creek network stayed the same, or we used the same plants, but we just changed the creek system. So either one that was of high complexity or one that was of low complexity. And then we use the model to see which one was predicted to have more sedimentation, so hopefully also higher resilience. Well, what came out is that the creek structure is indeed more important than the single characteristics of the plants in determining sedimentation. You see, in fact, in the graph on the left, that if the plants are different, but the creek system is overall the same, then the sedimentation is really quite comparable. But if you would use the same plant and just change the creek system, then you would have a much higher sedimentation in the high complexity system compared to the low complexity one. So this is almost 3 times as much just by changing the creek system. So this would suggest that the indirect effects of the plants are more important than the direct local effects. And this is due to the fact we look again closer at our model predictions to understand why this would happen. Well, what we see with higher complexity of the creeks is that the flow velocities in the channels are usually also higher, which means more sediment can be transported. And by having a very highly branched creek network, everything in the marsh is closer to a creek, which means that they can also get more sedimentation. We will not, well, it will not be the focus of the talk today, but we did also go out in the field to try to test these model predictions. So we looked for places that had either low or high complexity, and we put instruments to also measure the flow velocities and the sediment concentrations and run experiments to see how much sedimentation there would be. And overall, these experiments confirmed the predictions of the model, so they could help us validate that. So far, I told you about how important complexity is, but of course, I'm not saying that vegetation traits have no impact on resilience. They do. And in fact, here we looked more closely at exactly how much each single trait of vegetation could affect resilience. You see, in this graph, we ran different simulations where we changed either the sediment supply, so how much sediment was available for the marsh to grow, and the rate of inundation or sea level rise. And with the different colors, you see what the model will predict as the final elevation of the marsh. And what you can notice is that usually if the sediment supply is higher, the marsh can, of course, grow up to higher elevation. So it is also better able to deal with higher rates of sea level rise. Whereas if you are here on the left side, if you don't have enough sediment input, then even at very low sea level rise rates, the marsh will just disappear. So this ratio between inundation and sediment supply is actually quite crucial for the marsh. And we then looked into exactly how much is the effect of single traits of vegetation. So we repeated this for by increasing vegetation density, height, or erosion protection potential. And what we found is that, again, these root system traits are really important because they tend to increase resilience. Whereas something that came quite as a surprise to us is that if you would increase vegetation height or density, the resilience could even decrease. So this tall, dense vegetation is not necessarily good for the adaptation of the marsh. And one of the explanations that we have for that is that if there is a very dense band of vegetation, it could tend to trap a lot of the sediment in front of the marsh before it can even travel more inland. So that is why, although it was counterintuitive for us, that's how we have our hypothesis to explain this. So the conclusions for this first part of the talk related to creek complexity is that plant species can indeed generate creeks of much different, of very different morphology. However, it doesn't seem, well, the more important effects seem to be indirect. So through the creation of complexity of creek networks more than specific traits. So in overall, biology does affect morphology, but ultimately it's the morphology that is more important for sediment transport and likely also for resilience of these marshes. And I think this has also important insights for how we can apply this to marsh restoration, because what we see usually is that a lot of projects focus on getting the optimal conditions for the growth of vegetation. So perhaps the optimal elevation or the optimal inundation for plants, but they don't really look into the optimal channel configuration. So I would suggest instead of trying to get vegetation to grow and expand as fast as possible, it would be important that these plants have also the chance to develop an extensive creek network, because overall, over the long term, this could increase resilience. And I think this makes a good transition then to the second part of my talk, where I would like to go over how we use this model, but in this case also for a more applied research context, which is that of salt marsh restoration. First, let me mention why are we restoring salt marshes? Well, one of the reasons we do that is that in many places in the world, salt marshes have disappeared. In the Netherlands, even there's estimates of maybe that we lost up to 90% of what used to be the salt marshes in the country. So there's really quite a big impact. So in order to try to compensate for that, there are measures such as those called managed realignment that you see here, in which usually prior to realignment, you have a coastal defense like a dike. And what would happen with the managed realignment is that this coastal defense or dike would be opened, so would be breached. You allow, again, the tides to go in and out, and in the sense, you recreate an intertidal habitat. However, I'm curious to know from you if you think that you can just that easily create an ecosystem. Maybe it is, not so easy to do. In fact, if you look at some of these restoration projects, you can see that the way they are developing is not really going as planned or as we hope. This is an example from the UK. You see, well, over here, the natural salt marsh, and in blue, I show the area that was restored. So already you can notice some things. You can see that the natural creeks have a lot of complexity, branches, they have all these meanders. But if you look into the restored area, it has just a few creeks and there are quite simple channels. So they just follow these drainage ditches that I think are remaining from agricultural land. So this is, not really promising as a result. Especially, I want to point your attention to the year that this project was made. This was 1995, so now almost 30 years. So it's not like we are looking at this just a year after. It's been a while, but still, we didn't reach the natural state that we hoped. So in this study, we wanted to see whether we could learn from this and maybe learn how we could build better climate resilient marshes for the future. And for that, we looked at 14 sites that are spread across the Netherlands, Belgium, and the UK. And in particular, we looked at two approaches to restoration. So in one case, once the restoration is made, the creeks are also excavated, so man-made into certain shapes, like you see on the left. In the middle case, the area was restored just by breaching the dike, and then these creeks all developed naturally. And then, of course, we also needed to consider some natural salt marshes. So we looked also at 9 natural sites because that's our, anyway, reference or the final endpoint that we would like these marshes to develop towards. But you can also see that there are some differences already because in natural sites, the creeks tend to become narrower as they go inland. But you see here, sometimes the excavations are done just in creeks that are equally wide everywhere. So that already suggests that maybe this could have been improved. So in this study, we wanted to compare the natural and restored marshes, especially looking at the structure of the patterns. So how is the geometry of the channels different? We wanted to look also at the ecosystem functioning. So how well do they drain the water? And finally, whether they are how resilient they are to sea level rise, again, looking at the sediment trapping and transport processes. For the first part, so to get the creek properties, we use remote sensing data, and particularly digital elevation models, and using the Python package Tidal GeoPro from one of our collaborators, Olivier Gourgues, we were able to extract automatically the creeks, and this is especially targeted towards tidal channels. And then we were able to get all the properties that were of interest for us. So how wide are the creeks, how deep, what are the slopes and the cross-sectional areas. Well, what came out of this analysis is that restored marshes are still quite different from natural ones. You see that usually they have less creeks because the channel network is significantly lower in extent. They also lack the landscape heterogeneity that we tend to find in natural sites. So they are much flatter overall. And they also tend to be less efficient in draining water or transporting sediment because in restored sites, the distance to a creek is much higher. So points in the marsh are usually farther from channels. And a recent study from Shirol et al. Also found similar patterns in other restoration sites, more in the UK. Well, so far we've seen that these restored sites are different, at least in terms of patterns, but we still have the question of whether they would be more or less resilient as well. So for that, we used our model to test the resilience of all these restoration projects. And we did so in two ways. So first, we looked, let's say, this case of the Bergpolder site. So we took the creeks as they are in reality, and we put them as initial conditions in our model, which is what I call the real-world case. And on the right, you see instead the idealized case. So we started with just flat landscape, no initial creeks, and we let our model predict what the area would look like. And I would like to point you to some differences. Already in the idealized case, you can see that the creeks tend to take the shortest path to the entrance, which is, of course, makes sense because the water would take the path of least resistance and the shortest path. But here you see that the creeks were made in this sort of, well, quite sharp turns, which is rather unnatural, and we don't really tend to see that in natural creeks. But what you also can notice is that in the idealized case, the final elevation seems to be overall higher than the real-world case. So this would also point to the fact that resilience might be higher. So we did these two sets of simulation, either in the case where the creeks were excavated in certain shapes, but also in the other case that I talked about before, so the one where all the creeks develop naturally. So if there were any creeks, we also put that as initial conditions in our model to see exactly how would the model predict these to develop. Well, what we found is that indeed built marshes, and especially the ones that deviate from natural patterns, tend to be less resilient. Here I show you the result of all the sites that we model all together. So if they had excavated creeks at the beginning, we see that if we use the model with the creeks as they are in reality, the sedimentation rate is significantly lower than what our model would predict to develop just by not imposing any creeks. So it seems worse to dig creeks in a natural shape than maybe not digging any creeks at all. But what is also interesting is that if we do the same, but we consider the restored sites that didn't have excavated creeks, so where all these develop naturally, then we don't really see a difference in sedimentation. So this suggests indeed that the closer you are to a natural pattern, the better it would be for the sedimentation processes in the marsh. And it also gives us some confidence in the model capability to predict how these areas develop in the future. So the main takeaways from this study is that man-made salt marshes are indeed different. So they are different in terms of structure of the pattern and in terms of functioning, but they're also less resilient than the natural ones. So what can we do? How can we perhaps in the future build more climate resilient marshes? Well, this might sound obvious, but we should mimic these self-organized natural creek patterns as much as possible. And I said, although it does sound obvious, it hasn't been done as much, at least until now. So yeah, my suggestion would be that it could be good to dig creeks at the start of a restoration project, but trying to look for the most similar natural counterpart, or perhaps also using models to predict what would be the most efficient creek shapes to use. I would now like to conclude overall from what I've, just give some takeaways from my talk. So on one hand, we looked at adaptations to sea level rise. And what would be more important in this case would be to preserve this channel network complexity that we've seen so far. But it means also leaving enough space for marshes to develop, because if they have enough space, they can also develop this nested network of creeks, as we saw, from first order up to fourth or fifth order. So all these different spatial scales that can develop. And on the other hand, in terms of restoration, what I can suggest in order to make better restoration choices in the future would be that we should mimic the self-organized natural pattern as much as possible, and also focusing on not only on plant growth conditions, so not only trying to get vegetation to grow as fast as possible, but also focusing on optimal channel configurations. And with that, I would like to conclude, and I'll be very happy to take any questions. Thank you for the attention.
Hi, Loretta. So thank you very much. Georgia, do you want to continue?
Sure, I'm just looking at the question and answer chat. I cannot see question right now, but I don't know if it is. Okay, now I can see first comment by Cecilia. So first question is from Cecilia. I'm gonna read it for Loreta. So question from Cecilia Bittoni is, can I ask why are the marshes disappearing?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Well, at least in the case of the Netherlands, the main reason was that the land was reclaimed, so it was used then for agriculture or just for human use. And that is one of the reasons. And in other places, they are disappearing because of sea level rise, and perhaps there's not enough sediment to keep up, like it's the case for some sites in the United States. And that is why it's been disappearing. But yeah, for the Netherlands, it's been mostly reclamation.
Okay, thank you, Loreta. And there is also another question by Paolo Ciavola, who is asking how do you start the model? Just a tidal flat with no vegetation? And when do you introduce vegetation?
Yeah, thank you for the question. We usually start randomly with some small seeds of vegetation, and then we let that develop on its own. So there could be some conditions where these small seeds of vegetation cannot grow up to full plants. So we can play around with this establishment chance and with how much of the vegetation we want to start with at the beginning. However, we've also been able to run the model just without any plants. And in that case, you still get creeks, but much more simple ones. So it is introduced right at the start.
Okay, so it is from the start time, or
yes, yeah.
or you're directly avoid to compare the effect of introducing the vegetation. So it is a with versus without.
Yeah, you can also introduce it later on. I never just tried myself, but it is possible. Yeah.
Okay, so I will continue to read, to scroll down the chat. There is another question from Yassen Hassan, who is asking how long it takes to restore marshes.
Yeah,
which maybe it is more general, so it could maybe depend on the specific case.
Yeah, there's also, so far, I think the oldest ones are not that old even. So there's many done in the last, let's say, 10 years, others go up to 30, 50 years ago. So yeah, that is pretty much the data, at least the ones that I work with. And sometimes I think if the conditions are not right, then you would not be successful with the restoration, even if you wait quite long.
Sorry, Loretta, let me
Yeah.
ask you again. This is a very important question, how long it takes. So how long would you say it takes for a place without restoration to become partially restored with some kind of creeks and adequate channels?
So the creeks themselves, they can start quite fast. So there are some cases where after some years you already see the creeks developing, and then you usually see the plants growing right next to the creeks, because that's the places where there's better drainage. So it means also the conditions for the plants are better, and from that it should start to spread and grow into more of a marsh platform rather than just isolated plants. So yeah, I would say around at least 5 to 10 years of time.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, in the meanwhile, a lot of questions show up, so I'll try to go fast through them, just skipping the ones that are very close to the others you already answered. So there is a question regarding the damage that you show us that was due to the digging compared to the compared to letting the channels to develop on their own. So the question is if digging a new channel is really more beneficial.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I've seen, even when comparing the ones with or without channels, there was no significant difference between them. So it even led us to think, so is it really better to do it? Because that's also quite expensive to do, but it is usually done with the idea that it should speed up the restoration process. Because if you have already some channels, then the water can better drain. And in that case, it should be better also for some vegetation to start to grow. However, it seems that if the digging is done, without really considering what shapes or what sizes the creeks should have for that certain area, then it might be doing worse. There's cases where the creeks were made so wide that then there was not enough energy for the water to erode and further expand the creeks. So in that case, I think it's really good if there is any way to use models where you can impose also like the local condition of elevation, tidal ranges, and sizes of the marsh to see what shapes would be better for that particular location.
Okay. I would like to ask a question from my side, which is strongly related to what you are saying. So thinking of these man-made creeks, is it only a matter of width of the channels, or there were other, let's say, mistakes in the digging phase, or something that you believe was not considered?
Yeah, so I started to look, but I didn't show it here, but I looked for relating the tidal range and also the area of the marsh, because that will affect also how much water needs to be drained by these channels. And I look at where natural submarshes would fall along this line. So looking at the size of the marsh and the size of the channel in terms of cross-section, mostly, so width and depth. And in that way, I could see which ones were the sites that were really far from this ideal line, or either being too big or too small for the area. However, I have to say that this doesn't consider the sediment properties at all. So there are studies that show that when you try to restore a marsh that used to be agricultural land, then the soil is very compacted. And that's also a very big problem with getting channels to erode. But in my case, I could not do any experiments in the field on that. So it's all based on sizes of creeks.
Okay, so this is interesting. So depending on the area, maybe there should be a preliminary study on the kind of sediments before taking a decision.
Yeah, for one case of restoration of a freshwater marsh, we also collaborated with the people designing the channels, and we tested out different of their designs in our model to see what would come out and perhaps what would be the best option. So I think that is a good way to communicate with the managers as well.
Okay, thank you, Loreta. So another interesting question is about the case of the Venice Lagoon. So Anna Rosinska is asking about the Venice Lagoon because there is evidence that the MOSE activation is affecting sedimentation in a negative way for the Venice Lagoon. And the Barene, the salt marshes are eroding there. So do you know any work or do you have any suggestion how this problem could be addressed by nature-based solution?
Okay. Yeah, I have not worked in that system really, so I'm sorry, no, I
Yeah,
cannot
it is
give.
very specific.
Yeah.
Let me see.
Georgia is an interesting philosophical point, but the one from Murray on
I have to scroll down
and measure both complexity and resilience.
Yeah, it's a good point. So for complexity, we look mostly at some parameters that were used in previous studies. So for instance, the bifurcation ratio, which means how many channels of a first order you have as compared to second, third order, and so on. So really this degree of branching, as well as unchanneled path length. So what is the mean distance from any point in the marsh to a creek, with the assumption that having more creeks and a more, let's say, branch structure is more complex. And for resilience, we looked at this combination of sediment supply and inundation rates. And we looked at what would be the final elevation that the marsh can reach in all these cases. And resilience was defined as pretty much the slope of, well, that's quite hard to show without the graph. Maybe I can pull that up again if you don't mind. Yeah, so in this graph, we looked at, again, the sediment supply rate and the rate of sea level rise. And then we took the average slope of the contour lines with the assumption that if the slope is higher, then it means that the marsh can reach a higher elevation for the sediment, with the same sediment supply rate. I hope that helps in explaining it. So we then did the same graph, but just changing, for instance, just the height of the plants or just the density or just the root system. And in that case, you would get a different picture because the final elevation is different. And you can, again, calculate it because we wanted, in the end, to have one number that quantifies resilience. So that seemed one of the possible options.
Okay, I will move to a question from Billy Curafolo. She's asking, in order to achieve optimal creek restoration that mimics the natural system, I would think that external factors are important to consider, especially the neighboring ocean currents and the upstream freshwater flows. So are there any plans to consider such inputs into your model?
Yeah, actually, I'm now working on very different projects. So I know of other people, well, back at NEOS, who are looking more into this, but from the perspective of the freshwater marshes. And in that case, also these issues of the salinity and the mixing between the waters is becoming important for them. So I can definitely suggest that they pick that up. It's good points.
Okay, so so far you are considering the information in terms of sea level, right, as input for your model. So there was a question above, I missed right now, but someone was asking for the accuracy of the satellite estimate that you mentioned and the resolution of the satellite data that you are using.
Yeah, the satellite data were, in terms of horizontal resolution, 1 by 1 meter cells. And I think for the vertical resolution is more in the order of, usually for this type of data, I think half a meter. So indeed, there might be some error in in estimating how, let's say, how deep these creeks are, or you cannot detect creeks that are smaller than 1 meter. That's just the limit of the resolution of the data.
Okay, so I will continue because there are many questions. So another one by Carlo Zupponi. He's asking if the restored salt marshes can develop creeks at a certain point, or if they never will because of their design and morphology.
Yeah, so there are some that would pretty much never develop creeks. So if you see that they were agricultural land, then they only have the ditches that were before used to separate the different agricultural, let's say, parts of land. So we unfortunately looked also in time. I've seen that in some places there was really not that much of a change over time. Others did a lot better though. So I tried, at least for the paper that we are preparing, to look at all the different effects and try to relate which one would be associated with a better outcome in terms of expansion of creeks, as opposed to the ones that seem to really reduce that.
Okay. And then there is a more technical question by Sebastian Raimondo about the sedimentation experiment that you did. How did you set up the morphology of the marshes? Did you use as a boundary condition, or was it also self-organized? Which I don't know exactly.
Yeah, so we, if these areas were surrounded by dikes, we put also the dikes in the model. So we were just looking at what would happen inside the dike. And then we created the creeks by artificially, instead of starting from just a flat landscape, we artificially created the creeks as a starting point in the model. So, however, because it is anyway highly idealized, and then to be able to compare within the cases, we didn't start with the actual elevation of that specific case. So the next step would be maybe to use a more, physically realistic model, and then put exactly all the conditions of the area. So the exact, let's say, depths and the exact elevations of that. I hope that answers it.
Okay. So
Can I
sure.
point to the question? That's another important one. Are there any differences in carbon sequestration between marshes with higher and lower creek complexity? That means depends on the growth of the plants, or maybe more. Say, please. Do you know?
I haven't looked into that. I know there's differences in carbon sequestration between restored and natural, with the restored not sequestering enough carbon, for sure. I don't know if anyone really looked at complexity. One of the tricky things with complexity is that it tends to increase over time, although not always. So it was at least also hard for us to find a simple and a complex marsh that had similar ages, because that also affects all kinds of other factors in the marsh. But that's a good idea for a study, for sure.
Thank you. We have still 4 minutes to the hour. Do you have another question, Giorgia?
Yeah, I have a curiosity, honestly, because when you were speaking, I was thinking of our SFERE models. So I was wondering if your models here can be easily adapted also to estimate the changing morphology along a river estuary. So if we can eventually consider this model jointly with an estuarine model to get an estimate of the bed sediments along the river in the future, so in order to update the depth of our estuaries.
Okay. That would be really nice. I mean, this started as more of a river model as well, but it was in that case also separated from the salt marsh model. We never tried to do a continuum, but that sounds nice to try at least.
Okay, so this could be a promise for the future.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I have another question for you before we go. So what is the, you know, what is the relationship of what you found with our benthic plant restoration? I mean, are there creeks on the bottom between the benthic vegetation that we never really accounted for?
In your case, was that more seagrass?
Yeah, seagrass.
I think
So we are down to 5 meters or even 2 or 3 meters depth.
I think you would have done like open spaces between the seagrass plants, but not necessarily creeks, I would say. That it's more of bare and vegetation type of pattern.
But at the same time, I would advise to leave complexity in the vegetation restoration, in the bud and the structure.
Yes.
Yeah. There is another question here, which I see that was kind of interesting, not interesting, actually interesting. Are there any differences in, sorry, it's, yeah, that's a very interesting one. I would like to ask if restored is Carlo Giupponi. Restored salt marshes can develop creeks at a certain point, or they never do.
Oh yes, this I think also came up earlier.
Oh,
yeah.
Already answered. Okay, that I found a very interesting one. Yeah. So everybody's very enthusiastic, Loreta. We need to see your next topic in a year or so.
Yes. Yeah, thanks for all the questions. Now I move more into, let's say, the open offshore areas and looking at wind farms and interaction with, between the sedimentation, the water and mussels. So it's quite a different topic, but I would be happy to speak again when I have some results on that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Again,
Thank you,
for the
Loreta.
invite.
Thank you,
Yeah.
everybody.
Thanks everybody for all the questions. I really appreciate it.
Bye.